Sanctuary, sanctuarium, from the Latin sanctus, divine, sacred, holy, or just, and arium, a container. A sanctuary is a place that holds what is holy, sacred, divine, or just. What is holy or sacred to Unitarian Universalists, more sacred than any symbol, object, or book could ever be? Love. Not the greeting card kind, a deeper kind. Love that honors our interconnectedness and interdependence, which are the very foundations of being. Love that shapes the meaning we make of our existence through our manner of being in this world. All we have in the end is the love we leave behind. Sanctus, sacred, divine, holy, just. It's beautiful that justice is right there with holy and sacred in Latin, as though they are of a piece. It reminds me of something that Jesus says in the Christian scriptures. He says, "Watch out for people who interpret the world falsely in relation to religion." He calls them false prophets. Watch out for false prophets. And he tells his listeners how to identify them. He says, "You will know them by their fruits." If we look at everything else, Jesus says, we can guess what he meant by fruits. He goes on and on about helping the poor, the afflicted, the stranger. He models it and he talks about it. He crosses social boundaries and even goes out of his own comfort zone to do it. But, and I've said this before, and I'll keep on saying it, he says nothing, not one thing about gays or abortion. It's all about helping the poor. Other religions also connect the divine with justice and mercy. The Quran tells us that we should serve God and do good to those in need, neighbors who are near, neighbors who are strangers, the companion by your side, the wayfarer that you meet, and those who have nothing. Isn't that lovely? Neighbors who are near, neighbors who are strangers, the companion by your side, and the wayfarer that you meet. In the Hebrew scriptures, it is written, "Do not neglect to show hospitality for strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. Remember those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured." And compassion and non-judgment are core values of Buddhism as well. Sanctuary, where we hold up what is divine, holy, sacred, and just. The word sanctuary has a connotation of inviolability, too, which is why we speak of sanctuaries as safe places, like a wildlife sanctuary, where animals are safe from human harm, or political sanctuary, which is when a country agrees to take in a foreigner, protecting that person from arrest or persecution. There's a long tradition of offering sanctuary, meaning protection from unjust arrest, in churches, dating back to ancient Egyptians, Hebrews, and Greeks, and even beyond that. In the 1980s, some churches took up this mantle in the United States, providing asylum in what came to be known as the sanctuary movement. It all started in Tucson, Arizona, when a Presbyterian minister named John Fife was asked to visit a local hospital to provide some pastoral care. Over a dozen people had just arrived, picked up by Border Patrol in the Sonoran Desert with severe dehydration and heat stroke. And the staff had noticed the group wasn't just sick, they were traumatized. When Fife got there, the people told him heartrending stories about violence and persecution in their homelands in Central America. The political situation had become so dangerous there that the people had decided to leave, to become migrants, crossing international borders in search of safety. What would it take for you to leave your home, job, friends, church, extended family, culture, and everything familiar to you, and flee to an uncertain, unknown future in a foreign country with no guarantee of safety or shelter? It would have to be pretty bad. Bad enough that you had to decide whether to become a victim of it or to gather up your courage and leave. In Mexico, those migrants had encountered smugglers who promised to bring them across the US border. They crossed through mountainous terrain, walking all through the night, and then they found themselves in the desert. As the sun rose, the temperature reached 115 degrees. There was very little shade, only a few scrubby bushes. There were no towns, just sun, sand, scrub, cactus. The migrants told Fife that they were only half of their original group. Another dozen had died as they were walking that first day. Fife decided to help the group apply for political asylum. President Carter had signed the Refugee Act of 1980, declaring that asylum was for anybody with a legitimate fear of persecution or violence in their home country, whether it was due to race, ethnicity, political, religious, or social group. Anybody who needed it could apply, and asylum was supposed to be granted on humanitarian and not political grounds. So the case seemed clear, and Fife expected the process to be fairly straightforward. Instead, what he found was that while the US approved asylum requests for people from communist countries, it often denied requests from Central Americans, sometimes shipping people back to the violence within days of their hearing. It wasn't hard to see that political motivations were at work. Not only did the US have a point to make in accepting asylum seekers from communist countries, it had a point to avoid in denying asylum seekers from Central America. The truth was, the US was actively supporting the leaders of violent regimes there, and to accept asylum seekers would mean acknowledging that the US was supporting human rights violations. At its height, about 500 churches got involved, including some Unitarian Universalist congregations. At one point, the government sent 2 undercover operatives into John Fife's Presbyterian Church. Fife recalls that the operatives kind of stood out from the beginning. They were wearing crucifixes, but they were rougher than most of the church volunteers he was used to seeing, and they seemed to have an awful lot of experience on the border. It turned out the 2 men were former coyotes, human smugglers, whom our government had arrested and then cut a deal with. If they'd wear a wire and help get the leaders of the sanctuary movement arrested, the government would let the coyotes go free. On the morning of his arrest, Fife was asleep when he heard a loud banging on his door. He opened it, and there stood 2 uniformed immigration officials. His first thought, he says, was the group of migrants inside his church just across the street. So he made the agents coffee, and he read the indictment they handed him line by line. And he stalled, and he stalled. Eventually, though, 63 migrants were arrested and 16 leaders indicted. Now, at first, the leaders were actually looking forward to their day in court. They were acting on clear religious teachings to care for the stranger, the wayfarer, the person facing unjust persecution. And also, importantly, the way they saw it, they weren't the lawbreakers, the government was, for ignoring the Refugee Act and not doing what it said to do. The trial would be a chance to shine a big, huge light on that. And then they suffered a major setback when the federal judge in charge made the decision to bar any discussion of several topics. The topics were US refugee law, international refugee law, conditions in El Salvador, conditions in Guatemala, and religious faith. Fife's lawyer drew an analogy to a man whose car breaks down on the road on a winter night when it's 40 degrees below zero, and he walks to the only house around, and he finds it locked with no one home, and he breaks in to get warm. And then he's charged with breaking and entering with none of the story allowed in court. Without the context, Fife and his group were sure to lose. Sure enough, they were found guilty. Fife went home and organized his congregation to deal with his imprisonment. And then, at last, to everyone's surprise, and possibly due to the public pressure, that same judge only gave them 5 years of probation no jail time. Fife went right back to providing sanctuary again, just as he had told the judge he would. At that point, the government decided to move on. And where did they move on to? Albuquerque. It turns out they came here, and they arrested a man and a woman here. This time, a jury found them not guilty. And between those two outcomes, the sanctuary movement retained its strength, and it continued on for some time. Since then, there have been many changes in our world, but one thing that has not changed is the reality of people migrating to the United States. I'm going to share a lot of information with you in the second half of this sermon, and I'll make the text available on the church website this week if you'd like to see my sources, which I'll list in the notes. There are about 43.3 million foreign-born people living in the United States. A little over 20 million of those are naturalized citizens. 13 million are lawful permanent residents. 1.7 million hold temporary visas. And about 11 million are unauthorized to be here. A little over a quarter of all those foreign-born residents are from Mexico. Others come from China, India, the Philippines, and other countries around the world. Among those who are undocumented, in 2014, almost half, 42%, had entered the country with permission. Then they overstayed their visas. Visa overstays exceeded unauthorized border crossings every year from 2007 to 2014. But that's not what we hear about in the news, is it? There are many reasons people choose to come to the US. Some come for school or employment or to be with family. Others, like those who took sanctuary in the 1980s, come because they have made a brave choice to survive. Within the mix of reasons, US policy and practices continue to play a behind-the-scenes role in migration too. For example, about 1.5 million small farmers were driven out of work between 1993 and 2005 after US promotion of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Meanwhile, our system for authorized immigration is inadequate, to say the least. We need people to fill jobs, and there are people who want and need those jobs, but there aren't enough visas available to meet the demand. And for unskilled workers who have no family members in the US, there's virtually no opportunity to come with proper documentation. Part of the problem is that US law says that people from any one country cannot exceed 7% of our total immigration, regardless of the US's relationship with that country. So Mexico and Liechtenstein face the same limit, even though Mexico is an economic partner located right next door to us and is over 3,400 times bigger in population than Liechtenstein. We also don't really have an appropriate infrastructure to support the process that we have in place, and as a result, the system is ridiculously slow. Becoming a citizen currently takes from 6 to 28 years, sometimes longer. If you have a visa that expires while you are waiting and you don't leave the country immediately, you could be arrested and deported. When my husband was an exchange student, he ran into this. He applied to stay for a second year while he was still here, but when he was waiting to hear back, the expiration date on his visa came around, and he flew back to Colombia, only to learn a few weeks later that his request had been approved. Too late. Luckily, he had the means to return after trying again. Lucky for me. There have been children who applied for citizenship as minors, and they had to wait so long that they turned 18 before the process was complete, which meant they had to start all over again at the back of a different line with even longer wait times, putting them at risk for arrest and deportation. There are people whose parents brought them to the US as young children who have no memory of ever living anywhere else, and they may not even have known their own immigration status until they became old enough to apply for college or a job. Until DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, there wasn't much hope for them. I'm so glad the president has decided to keep that program. Being in the US without authorization is a civil, not a criminal offense. But you wouldn't know that from our government's response. The government spends more on immigration enforcement than all other federal criminal law enforcement agencies combined. It's nearly an enforcement-only approach. And you guys, the enforcement is brutal. It is duplicitous. It's based on misleading people. And it's especially harmful to children and families. Immigration enforcement in the US is characterized by an armed, militarized approach. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents, which are known as ICE agents for short, bang on doors and they barge into homes typically at 4 or 5 in the morning while it's still dark, and people, parents and children, are asleep in their beds. Agents wear uniforms that say police on them, but they are not police. They hold papers in their hands that say warrant, but they are rarely the judicial warrants required in order to barge into someone's house, workplace, or school. They aren't signed by a judge. Instead, they are a sleight of hand. They are relatively powerless administrative warrants. But as you can imagine, the whole spectacle, the timing, the banging, the uniforms, and the paper that says warrant on it is so completely intimidating that people just comply. They don't know about, or they're too scared to exercise their right to close the door and get a lawyer. So they're arrested and imprisoned in private prisons where for-profit companies make money off of the whole ruse. Because it's a civil offense and not a criminal one, immigrants aren't provided with a lawyer automatically. If they can't afford one, or if they can't find one who will travel to a remotely located detention center, they have almost no chance of avoiding deportation. When night falls in the US, people are hunted, writes the journalist Maria Hinojosa. ICE also conducts daytime raids, and in recent years, some real police have been cooperating with ICE, with the result that something like an expired license plate tag can lead to deportation. Several years ago, a group from First Unitarian and I visited a shelter for deported persons in Nogales, Mexico. And what I remember most from that trip is how many people are dropped across the border with only the clothing on their backs. Sometimes they don't have their ID, money, or wallet. They may not have had a chance to tell their loved ones in the US what happened to them. They simply disappeared when ICE picked them up. Deportations have a devastating impact on families. Sometimes children who may themselves be citizens are forced into foster care when their parents are taken. Others find themselves suddenly in single-parent households that struggle financially. In particular, when a father is deported, family income can drop by about 73%. Breaking up families and thrusting mothers and children into poverty. This is national security. Using these tactics and others, the Obama administration deported more than 2.7 million immigrants, over 900 per day, a record number. During his presidential campaign, Donald Trump said that even that was not enough, and he vowed to increase it. He made harsh, sometimes outwardly racist comments about immigrants, and he vowed to repeal the few changes Obama had put in place, such as instructing ICE to focus on people with criminal records. Trump vowed to actually make it a crime and not a civil offense to be in the US without permission. Using that logic, many immigrants would be forced to serve prison sentences before being deported. For these reasons, after the election, fear rippled through immigrant communities. Some people refused to leave their homes. People stopped showing up at classes, at court dates, even at hospitals. In response to everything, a new sanctuary movement had already begun a few years ago. And this weekend, the Interfaith Immigration Coalition, a national group that includes our denomination, is conducting a Father's Day campaign with the hashtag Don't Deport My Dad. We're taking part in that campaign by focusing on immigration today. So, let's take a breath, right? This is terrible. It's terrible what's happening. What is a church to do? Here are some steps that we're taking and some things that individual people can do. First, it's important for as many people as possible to know what the law really says and to insist that our government and its agents follow the law. I told you about those sneaky administrative versus judicial warrants. That's one example. This spring, our board of directors issued a statement supporting staff and volunteers at First Unitarian in exercising our legal right to decline to comply with ICE. In other words, we have rights, and the board supports us in using them to the full extent of the law. The board asked me to ensure that we held a couple of trainings for staff and key volunteers, and I did that in April. Now, so far, there are no reports of ICE agents entering or attempting to enter a church, and that's because churches, along with hospitals and public rallies, are considered sensitive locations, which is a way of saying it would look terrible and really make people mad if ICE barged into them. However, ICE agents have been spotted doing surveillance on at least one church. And protection of sensitive locations is not a law. It's just a preference that presidents have agreed to so far. That could change. To prepare ourselves for that possibility, our board wanted to make sure that we knew what our rights are. The board also formed a task force to investigate what First Unitarian needed to know about providing sanctuary and how we could be prepared in case help became urgently needed. The task force did hours of research. They hosted meetings and learning sessions, gathered names of interested volunteers, and attended events in the wider community. And in the process, they learned about the concept called expanded sanctuary. First Unitarian is an expanded sanctuary congregation. That means we're actively supporting a sanctuary congregation in town, the Friends Meeting House. The board issued a statement about that too, and I know many of us have volunteered in person there. And we have programs that serve all, including outreach programs and these Sunday services. They serve all regardless of whether a person is documented. Now, we do not ask about anyone's immigration status, and I hope you won't either. And we don't keep records about such things. That way, nothing we know or have could be used against people in our community. In order to protect the people that we're already serving here at First Unitarian, we've decided for now not to provide sanctuary in the sense of having somebody live inside our church. Hosting somebody on a long-term basis like that would definitely attract the attention of ICE agents, and we realize how much that would undermine the safety of other potentially undocumented people who participate in our services, ESL, after-school tutoring, Family Promise, Food Pantry, and other programs we have. So we have opted to focus on safety for the people already with us. Next, and this one's exciting, this is starting today, we're establishing a Citizenship Scholarship Fund. Although not all people have access to the path to citizenship, when somebody does, it makes a huge difference in their life and in the lives of their family members. When one adult in a family becomes a citizen, it not only creates security for that person, but it opens a pathway for them to apply for legal status for any spouses, children, or other relatives here as well. But becoming a citizen can be pretty expensive. There are fees, there's time off work, and childcare needed to meet with officials. Sometimes an immigration lawyer has to be hired to help with the process. And then at the end, just to formally apply, there's a $725 fee. That's a lot of money. So today we're launching a scholarship fund to cover that for students of our ESL program. Our goal is to raise just $2,175 to help pay for 3 application fees. And it turned out we still had a little bit of money left over from a past immigration project, so one more fee has already been funded. There will be a table out in the social hall, just down the hall here, if you'd like to help a neighbor out in this way. And you can make a donation by cash, check, or credit card. At the same table, you can also sign up to volunteer with the New Mexico Faith Coalition for Immigrant Justice, doing things like accompanying people to court to discourage ICE from deporting them, showing up as a protester or as an observer at an immigration raid so that the government knows that any sneaky tactics or aggression is being witnessed, and so that we might have a chance to just slow ICE down and make sure attorneys are present to talk with people. You can sign up to support the Friends Meeting House in their role as a sanctuary congregation, and you can also learn how to donate money directly to the New Mexico Faith Coalition for Immigrant Justice, which coordinates all of those things. Remember when I mentioned that a man was arrested in Albuquerque for providing sanctuary in the 80s? Well, he was a pastor, and his son is the director of the New Mexico Faith Coalition for Immigrant Justice now. So let's champion their work for the wayfarer, the neighbor, the fathers, mothers, and love. Our closing song, Pauline is going to